want me to start?
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. Dear Vice Rector Chair, dear colleagues, first of all, I would like in this meeting to welcome you once more at the Global Civis Days. We're very happy that we have a high number of delegates. They have exceeded 320, which is very optimistic for the future of Civis. And as you all know, we have applied for Civis 2, which is the application for funding 2022-2026. And we are very eager to see the results, but we're very optimistic, which will come out in July. And the Civis objective for the next 4 years are in line with the European strategy for universities. The Civis Alliance join forces and invest in translational cooperation to educate a new generation of European citizens on key contemporary challenges. And I would like to mention some of those. Of course, climate, environment, and energy has been one of the main themes of Civis since its start, since 2018. And of course, we see that every year it is becoming a more and more important issue. Society, culture, and heritage, and you will have, we will have the opportunity to see how we approach these issues and the European identity in the next few minutes. Health, and we are having now a Hub Health meeting ongoing in the premises of the museum of our university, which is also very promising, with more than 30 summer schools and webinars, and hopefully in the future with integrated masters. Cities, territories, and mobilities, and finally, digital and technological transformation. Our alliance is also going to proceed to accreditation via existing channels with an eye to having Civis educational offer certified in a range of forms, from joint European degrees to flexible educational modules embedded in existing programs which are already ongoing. To reach a systemic, structural, and sustainable impact, European universities need adequate funding, support, and financial stability. In view of the scale of the alliance's need and ambition, their financial viability will continue to depend heavily on EU programs as well as national support. Lastly, environmental sustainability within Civis has two facets: encouraging sustainable forms of mobility on one hand, and the green digitalization agenda on the other hand. Thus, again, I would like to welcome you all. After this meeting, we will have a buffet dinner starting after 7 p.m. And this will be accompanied by music offered by the students of the music department of our School of Philosophy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rector Magnificus of the National Kapodistrian University of Athens, Professor Dimopoulos. My name is Monique Scheer. I am standing in today for Professor Dorothee Kimmich, who would normally be able to chair this panel, but she had to cancel, unfortunately, her participation today. She's the co-chair of the Hub on Society, Culture, and Heritage, together with Dora, who's also with us here, because it is a Tübingen-Athens co-cooperation chairing this hub on this important topic. And that's what we'll be discussing in this panel, this second of our three words, culture. It's a very central concept for the hub. And I think we have realized a central concept for the European Commission. And this became very clear recently in January, when the Commission issued a new strategy for the universities in Europe. Perhaps you took note of this new strategy for higher education. If you go to the website of the Commission, you will find 2 statements there on this new strategy. One of them is from Commissioner Maria Gabriel, who is Commissioner for Research and Education and Higher Education, and also from Commissioner and Vice President Margaritis Chinas, who is the Commissioner for the European Way of Life. And these 2 commissioners give statements on this new strategy for European universities, which is interesting in and of itself, that the universities, higher education, seems to be closely linked to this notion of the European way of life. And Commissioner Maria Gabriel says, quote, "Students need modern transnational campuses with easy access to mobility abroad to allow for a truly European study path and experience." End of quote. Commissioner Chinas says, quote, "Universities are both a condition and a foundation for our European way of life. They support open, democratic, and fair societies, shared values, more mobility, broader scope and synergies to build a genuinely European dimension in our higher education," unquote. So let's consider these 2 statements from the European Commission a little more closely. I would say that Commissioner Gabriel is making a claim for European diversity, that students, a European student path involves mobility between different countries in Europe so that you can experience the differences all across the continent. This, one might say, this argument for cultural diversity in Europe could be seen as going back to the culture concept from anthropology, the concept that each society has its own culture, and that it might even be something like a national character. And this might be a rather essentializing concept of culture, which goes back to the German Romantic, perhaps even, to Herder's concept of Volksgeist. Chinas speaks of the European way of life. Obviously, it's also his remit as commissioner, which is also a concept from anthropology. The culture concept of anthropology was very closely tied to a notion of how we live, life ways, the way of life. And he speaks then of the European way of life. So perhaps it's more transnational, but and it's certainly picking up an anthropological concept. But then he switches to shared values. And this concept of values, I think, is very, very interesting. We've seen, I think, an uptick in the use of this term values in recent times, in recent months for sure, in the face of the conflict in the war in Ukraine, where European values are being defended. And it is the question, what do we mean when we say values, and what do we mean when we say a way of life? How do these overlap? I think that this is also a concept of culture that we are familiar with in sociology. If you are familiar with Talcott Parsons' work, you know that his definition of culture was very much linked to the notion of a value system. So values, perhaps the sociological concept of culture. And then if we look at other documents coming from the EU, for instance, when we look at the information on the website of Horizon 2020 and these funding instruments, we also see very often a concept of culture that is linked to high culture. So culture as music, art, creative work, but also culture as heritage. So archaeological sites and our cultural history in the sense of high culture, the highlights of culture, the artwork of the past. And these are linked then to the idea that these areas of cultural work can provide jobs for museums, for other cultural heritage institutions, and of course for the tourism industry and creative industries. So that is yet another concept of culture that is in the mix here. As an anthropologist myself, I'm very sensitive to the meanings of this term, culture. It's something that we study in anthropology and ethnology and cultural sociology related fields. Particularly in recent decades, there's been a very deep discussion in the anthropological disciplines about the essentializing potential of the culture concept. There has been a discussion of perhaps getting rid of the culture concept, that it's not very useful anymore because it's only going to lead to essentializations that essentially do the kind of thing that the concept of race has done and creates forms of cultural racism. So considering that we are very sensitive to the political potential of this concept of culture, we have over the years been trying to work with yet another meaning. So I'm going to introduce now a fourth meaning of culture that for anthropologists I think has become very, very common. And that is to say that culture is not so much a system, but in fact a practice. Culture is something we do. It's something that happens. It's a process. Anytime two people interact socially, there's a cultural dimension to that social interaction. So it's not a thing. It's a dimension of what we're doing. So that seems to us to be a way to get away from essentializing culture. It makes the concept more dynamic. Culture is constantly in motion when we think of it this way. It's open for change. It's not ossified and reified. It can integrate new elements. This is why culture is constantly changing, because other elements will come in. There are new practices, new aesthetics that become part of a culture and get passed around cultures. So just as we know that there is no language that can be absolutely pure, there is also no culture that can be absolutely pure. And we probably wouldn't want that to be that way. The focus instead should be on the processes of change that culture is constantly embedded in, and innovation within cultural processes and this happening of culture that I referred to. And this new sort of dynamic concept of culture, which has become the norm for the anthropological disciplines at least, really challenges, I think, in many ways, the political concepts that I started with. And that is why we would like to use this panel, this very interdisciplinary panel, to discuss this concept of culture. I've just presented four. We'll probably hear more concepts of culture that are being debated and discussed, because we have said in our hub that we are dedicated, as it says here in the program, that we are all in favor of encouraging a sense of Europeanness among the students. This is part of Civis's work, is to give us all more of a sense of being European and away from our national cultures. And yet we also want to be aware of the pitfalls of this culture concept, or this concept of the European, as it says here, encourage a critical approach to the concept and to the borders of Europe today, to the so-called European way of life. We can ask ourselves, what do we mean by that? And to the problems affecting marginalized societies, groups, and individuals. So I would like to thank the panel members for joining this panel today, and briefly introduce all of them. And then we will begin with a round of talks from each of them. I would like to begin to my left with Professor Fatane Farahani. Just a minute, I'm going to introduce each of you and then you can start. Professor Farahani is a professor of ethnology, like myself. She's from the University of Stockholm. I'm from the University of Tübingen. I forgot to mention that, sorry. And she specializes in migration and gender studies. To her, person over who's speaking next is Professor Zavaki, Assistant Professor of International Relations here in Athens at the National Kapodistrian University. She's an expert on EU organization and governance, and especially cultural governance. So we look forward to hearing her perspective on that. And to her left is Professor Mircea Dumitru, Professor of Philosophy, as I just picked up, Vice President of the Romanian Academy of Sciences. He's a professor and former rector of the University of Bucharest, and one of the founding members of Civis, if I might say so, was among the first board of rectors. And then in the middle, our final speaker is Ines de Castro, the director of the Linden Museum, of the State Museum of World Cultures, if you will, in Stuttgart, Germany, closely near Tübingen and closely related to Tübingen. So now we can begin with our talks, and Professor Farahani will begin. Okay.
Hello everyone, do you hear me?
No, not yet. Can you bring it down?
It's a problem to be too short. I thought that's my problem in Sweden, but here is... Hello everyone, do you hear me now? Okay. Hello. Okay. I would like to start by thanking all the organizers. I'm very happy to be here. And I would like to start by, as an ethnologist, as you mentioned, I would like by start actually situating myself in what I have done and what I'm going to present today. I was born in Iran and came to Sweden as a refugee when I was quite young. And my adjustment, to say the least, or interest to different academic milieu in different European university and even North American university has, in a personal level, has forced me or has confronted me to think and reflect over different aspects of what is my culture, what is the hosting culture of the society or the academic milieu that I am working within. And when it comes to my intellectual journey, I personally have very hard time to distinguish between my personal journey and intellectual journey, since as a researcher, as a professor in ethnology, I cannot find any moment in my academic life while I'm teaching, while I'm researching, while I'm asking questions, while I'm asked questions, while I'm writing, that my personal identity does not have an impact on the way that I treat the question, I treat my students or my colleagues treating me. So that is just kind of, for me, that's an everyday challenge, struggle, and surprises, and the learning process all the time. So I just wanted to start by situating myself in what I'm going to talk about. So I guess for most of us here, in one way or the other way, we have heard or we have reflected over the impact of the colonial history in construction of European politics or European economy. What today we would like to talk about is the impact, or I would like to start to talk about is the impact of the colonial history in construction of European culture and European identity, or what we call it as European culture or identity. So the narrative of the civilized Europe and European identity quite often disregards both the current and the past colonial history in construction of European identity, that how the European identity has always been constructed in regard to what or who they are not, or how they are more civilized in regard to those people who they are uncivilized. So the construction of the civilized Europe is always formed in relation to those people who are uncivilized. And of course, even in regard to so-called migration crisis, is the way that in the European Union and in Europe we have talked about that. It's just, it seems that the migration crisis, refugee crisis is constructed as a crisis external to Europe, instead of seeing that as a product of Europe itself and the history that we are embedded in. If I want to start by just kind of clarifying in regard to my own research, my early research started by studying Iranian men and women's sexuality, that what I call it diasporic sexuality. And in one way I call it that my studies is to focus on sexuality of migration. And I try to understand the experience of migration through the lens of gender and sexuality. That means that I have been interested to see how gender and sexuality has an impact on the reason, process, and the way that people receive in the so-called hosting countries. And on the way, and the other way around as well, that the people's gender has an impact on the way that they go through the migration. My research question has been, what constitute the desirable/undesirable feminine or masculine heterosexual subject, and how and if that changes when they leave their home countries? What do they have learned as a young girls in, for instance, Iranian society that makes me desirable in the so-called heterosexual matrix in Iranian society? And how and if it changes when I come to Europe? And how the different diasporic contexts shape different type of desirable feminine and masculinity. If I learned, or many men, for instance, learned in their own home society that being a breadwinner is the most important quality that a man can have and make them desirable, and come to Europe and they, lose their job. As somebody I talked to in Australia, for instance, he was a surgeon and become a taxi driver. So what happened to the way that, he himself look at himself as a desirable or undesirable man, and how the people surrounding look at him. So the reason I want to start by just telling a bit about my own early studies on sexuality and migration, that I want to reflect over how sexuality has been used as a civilizing or civilization signifier. That in the colonial history of Europe, we always, sexuality and gender has been something that we civilized people in Europe has this type of sexuality, and the other people have primitive, uncivilized sexuality. And of course, this hasn't been anything kind of been fixed. This has been changing. For 50, 60 years ago, it was impossible to see homosexuality as a civilization signifier in Europe. But now we see that as we civilized people have homosexuality, while those people are uncivilized. So sexuality has been always, used as a signifier for civilization in one way or the other. And in regard to gender and sexuality, of course, one of the discussions that during the last 20, 30 years in different European countries has been discussed is a concept of cultural clashes in regard to gender and sexual practices. That these people do not know the way that we live in Europe, at least, in the Swedish context that I am familiar with, that has been very much highlighted, that we have different type of culture in regard to gender and sexuality. So the first thing, as it was mentioned earlier, that one of the things that, that in that concept of cultural clashes, the culture represents as a fixed unities. Of course, fixed unities when it comes to other people, because our culture in Europe is changing all the time. There are other people's cultures that's fixed and needs to be evolved like our cultures. The other aspect in the cultural clashes is that, but men are given the privilege to define what is culture. For instance, in regard to honor-related violence, they are men's way of looking at a culture that have a privilege of definition. Women daily practices in regard to resisting veiling practices or honor-related aspects, this doesn't consider as a cultural practices. I mean, if you look at, all the young girls and women who are harassed, who are killed in Palestine, in Iran, in Kurdistan, they haven't come to Sweden or in Germany or whatever else. They have actually resisting their culture in their own home countries. So do we mean that there is any cultural clashes there as well, or they have become westernized? So what I'm meaning that, they are using their own cultural practices in order to resist their patriarchal culture. But in that concept of cultural clashes, we disregard that women interpretation of their culture, but we give men the privilege of definition of cultural practices. And of course, in that concept of cultural clashes, what's happening, we in Europe are supposed to save the Middle Eastern women or Muslim women. So that story of cultural clashes feel a function that we once again present ourselves as a civilized one, a feminist one, a liberated one, who want to rescue the other women and men of their own culture. And in that, if I just want to move to another concept that is used in, at least in the Swedish context, that, as you know, that in most of the countries, we are using different cultural, artistic, economic aspect that use our country as a brand. And those are some of the examples of Pippi Longstocking, Volvo, you name it, that is, Sweden uses as a brand. But another aspect that has been used quite often during the last 20, 30 years is actually using gender equality and what we call as latte daddies, that, in the Swedish context as a brand for Sweden, that, even when Sweden entered European countries, we were supposed to come to European Union in order to teach everyone to become as gender equal as we are. But this narrative of gender equal Sweden is just actually confronted with a huge problem during the Me Too. That all of a sudden, in the gender equal society like Sweden, that we have many women who actually came, what was specific for the Me Too movement in Sweden was that actually came from different occupations, that, artists, nurses, lawyers, you name it, from different jobs. And that is in a society that sexual harassment has always been in the regulation, that people actually could use that regulation in order to sue or just, report it. But all of a sudden, all these voices of the women comes, and as probably some of you have followed, that was, so high that even Swedish Nobel Academy was heated by that story as well. So that is another narrative of that gender equal, that meta-narrative of gender equal Sweden that was kind of, heated by that, the Me Too that was questioned that. So, but I am trying to do that, just the presence of the lot of diasporic community in the Sweden and the Europe constructed diasporic space that has an impact on the religious practices, of artist practices, of political practices, of sport, of you name it, as an academy. I mean, who could think of that, somebody like me teaches at a very traditional discipline in the Swedish university, the ethnology, and talk about, Iranian women's sexuality and do her PhD. So the diasporic space, make that has an impact even in the Swedish academy or European academy. So that type of, what is European identity? What is Swedish academy? What is Swedish music? What is Swedish stomach culture? So all of them is, the diasporic space, is changing. Having said that, doesn't mean that the diasporic space is equally divided, that everyone had the same type of power. Then it's come to the concept of integration, that Usually the concept of integration is used for the people, for the person who perceived as someone who has gained a certain level of social upward mobility. I am considered as someone who is integrated because I am a professor at Stockholm University. But does it mean that that is the kind of finished product? I don't need to prove my integration. No. The integration is, as gender scholars, Judith Butler says, that is like a performative act. I have always to prove that I am as integrated as I have to prove my femininity. It's enough that I dress different type of dress and you challenge or question my feminine character. That's the same thing. If today I was wearing the veil and presenting my presentation, my Swedish capital would, reduce 80% at least. So just, how, the concept of integration is something that I always should prove all the time. So just going back to the question that you mentioned in the beginning, what does that mean when we are going to teach our students the European way of living or having the European identity instead of opening up for, just who we are and who we have been and what has been has an effect or impact on the way that we have been living, and just being open to that, to this door. And I just want to finish that with one of the quote of one of my favorite scholars, Bell Hooks, who died a couple of months ago. I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. I saw in theory a location of healing. So I guess that's, for me, when I started to situate myself, that is the way that I'm looking at those, both theoretical and practical concepts of European identity and European identity formation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Farahani. And now we will hear from Professor Zavaki from your seat there. Okay.
Thank you. Is it fine? Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much. I would like to thank you for your kind invitation. And before starting, I would like to extend a warm welcome and wishes for success in this conference from the president of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, who could not be with us today in this panel. And I will speak from the point of view of a political scientist. So I will focus on the political culture dimension as part of the broader European identity issue. The concept of a European identity, the construction of an intermediate identity between global and national identities, has been traditionally perceived as a driving force and the result of European integration and often exclusion processes. It is true that European integration and membership is not restricted to structural and institutional prerequisites and legal obligations. It is also linked to the social ontology and processes of European integration and the emergence of a common or a distinct political culture in the European continent. It is a political culture that stems from the traditions of European liberal democracies, but also from the construction of coherent systems of meanings and orientations that finally drive political choices and social action vis-à-vis common challenges in the European Union and beyond. Quoting Simone Weil back in 1979, we can easily discern the diachronic character, the diachronic nature of these challenges, of the challenges EU member states are faced with. the challenge of peace, the challenge of freedom, and the challenge of prosperity, only to be met through the European dimension. These challenges are related to the core European values accounting for the trajectory of the European states after the Second World War and, of course, after the Cold War, based on an alternative narrative of European political coexistence among European states. And if we try to find the main features of EU political culture as part of the broader notion of European identity, we should start from the civic character of this kind of political culture, related to the openness and the democratic character of the European polity, as, quoting Almond and Verba, a culture that combines modernity with tradition, a pluralistic culture based on communication and persuasion. And here we have to refer to the approach of Habermas concerning communicative action and the work of Thomas Riese on European Union integration process. A culture of consensus and diversity, a culture that permits change but also moderates it. This European civic culture is based on the core political values and constitutional traditions of member states, combining their different political cultures and subcultures. On the other hand, in an era of intersecting multilateralism, EU political culture embraces the normative legacy of the Council of Europe, since it is constructed within the broader European public order founded on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, and of course adherence to the principles of the UN Charter. What is the impact of this common or distinct political culture on European political cultures or subcultures? First of all, we have to mention the transformative effect of the European integration process itself. EU institutions have greatly contributed to the uniformization of European political cultures. The impact of Europeanization on transforming political orientations and political actions, both of European elites and societies in member or candidate states, is illustrative. The examples, we have many examples, the move from parochial types of political culture in Italy or other Mediterranean states to more participant political cultures, or the move from subject political culture in Germany in the first decades after the Second World War, or post-communist states after the end of the Cold War, to a more participant political culture model is illustrative. This transformative effect is attributed to the interpretation of EU politics and agenda through evolutional orientations vis-à-vis the EU project, consisting of judgments, opinions about the position of states, regions, or even individuals within this setting, combining civic value standards and criteria with information and feelings. On the other hand, we have witnessed the emergence of new types of parochialism, mainly due to the persistence or emergence of different manifestations of nationalism that often breed what Diamandouros has described as an underdog culture. For example, in the rise of populism in different forms around Europe, across Europe, in Greece during the financial crisis, or in Central European countries as a reaction to the migration crisis. These phenomena are mainly the result of affective orientations or feelings about the national or the European political system, its roles, personnel, performance, that come to the fore with an impressive dynamism during crisis. It is true that crisis, of course, is not a new phenomenon in the EU integration process. However, we are witnessing during the last decade or decades that there is a qualitative shift in terms of the impact of those crises on the evolution of the EU construction. In the past, crises functioned as enablers for further integration. During recent crises, we have witnessed many member states advocating for the renationalization of policies, considering differentiated integration, or even opting for the exit option. Here, cognitive orientations determine the attitudes and the political decisions. That is, orientations that are dependent on the knowledge of and belief in the political system, whether national or European, its roles, the holders of these roles, its inputs and its outputs. In our case, cognitive orientations determine the answer to the question whether the EU narrative as a post-war peace-building prosperity and security project for the continent through democracy and economic interdependence is still relevant for states in the 21st century. The creation or the reinforcement of positive cognitive orientation vis-à-vis EU integration is inextricably linked to the role of education, and especially higher education. Education in the EU has for a long time been associated to the accomplishment of the Lisbon Agenda, the 2000 Lisbon Agenda, to become the most competitive, knowledge-based economy in the world. Education, however, is more than an asset in the European economic toolkit. Education should aim at transmitting knowledge, connecting history and past achievements, visions and failures with new challenges European societies are called to address at the global, national and subnational levels. Education should also facilitate the evolution of the European identity and political culture through the lens of these challenges, and also work for the development of creating certain civic skills in the European continent, combining common principles, sustainable development, tolerance, human rights, but at the same time leaving space for national, regional, or local realities. When we refer to the evolution of the European identity, of course, or the European political culture and the role of education, we should not neglect the younger generation. What kind of profile do younger Europeans have? How do they feel about the European political project in terms of values, in terms of processes, etc.? According to a Eurobarometer study entitled How Do We Build a Stronger, More United Europe, conducted in 2019, I was impressed to read that the young Europeans are actively engaged. 3/4 of the people questioned have been involved in some form of organized movement, political parties or movements, unions, student or youth organizations, campaigns, strikes or street protests, volunteering activities or local community projects. While more than 7 in 10 young respondents have voted in local, national or European elections. And this diffused the stereotypical perception of an apolitical youth in the European Union. Young people also consider that protecting the environment and fighting climate change, along with education and training, fighting poverty and social inequalities should be the top political priorities of the European Union. Last but not least, participants' expectations from education in the EU encompass critical thinking and access to the same opportunities. Subjects such as democracy and human rights, climate change and the development of eco-friendly behaviors, as well as the promotion of creativity, adaptability, and entrepreneurial mindsets. Our common project, CIVIS, I believe, or I hope that it encapsulates these perspectives. Drawing from an interdisciplinary and multi-level subject-based approach, it aims at the promotion of a European civic identity. A civic identity vis-à-vis knowledge, research, collaboration, and civic engagement. I believe that this university constitutes one action that could contribute to the evolution of the European narrative in a different way than Professor Farahani has mentioned. A narrative that will reflect our values and needs now, and not only ideas that emerged out of past calamities. Professor Scheer mentioned, made reference to the strategy for higher education and its main goal for deepening the sense of belonging to Europe based on common values. And creating, of course, prospects for addressing current and future challenges. The value of such an educational initiative and such a political trend in educational policy at the EU level brings to mind Aristotle's words: education is an ornament in prosperity and a refuge in adversity. And with these words, I would like to thank you for giving me the floor in this panel.
Now we will hear from Professor Dumitru from the perspective of philosophy. It's the best way to begin, right? With a blank slate.
Not anymore.
There we go. Tabula rasa.
Okay, Vice Rectors, colleagues, dear students. First of all, let me express my gratitude for inviting me, for having me here, especially to the hosts of this Civis Days event, which is hosted by the University of Athens. I helped creating this consortium some, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, before I stepped down in December 2019. So happily I was a pre-pandemic rector. I stepped down right at the right time, in December 2019. And indeed, I guess one of the main ideas, main goals and ideals that we all had on our minds when we started the dialogue for creating this wonderful consortium was how we can contribute to shaping and reshaping, configuring, reconfiguring this common space, which is our European identity. And how can we do that? Through the processes, the mechanisms of higher education and research. And I'm going actually to change a bit the angle from which I'm going to look at those issues, because even though the strong presupposition was that we are going to speak about identity culture or cultures, what I'm going to do instead is to speak about identity, with an emphasis on identity cultures. It's not completely different, but from what you expect from me, which is the perspective of someone who is practicing logic, metaphysics, you name it. We are very much interested in how identity works in various contexts. And in my very short presentation, before I'm going to introduce a bit the notions and the methodology, the presentation comes into two parts. The first part is about how the humanities and social sciences are creating via universities, via our institutions, the cultural identity in Europe and the transmission, the carried out and carried over of the cultural values to the next generations of students and scholars. And in the second part, which maybe I'm going to leave out because the time is pressing us, what I'm having are some diary marks, a sort of lamentation on behalf of a person like myself who devoted the last 40 years of his life to the role of the humanities. And I submit to you that part of the crisis that we are experiencing now is the crisis of the humanities, not of the humanists per se, but of the way we relate in the political public space and also in the universities, in the academia, to the subjects that we offer in literature, history, anthropology, religion, divinity, and not to mention in the list philosophy. So first of all, on my slides, as you can already see, from this metaphysical perspective that I am raising here, thinking about identity is a hard and vexing issue. And from the outset, I want to point out that the topic of identity is primarily and most fundamentally a metaphysical issue, which of course ramifies into many, many other quarters: culture, religion, language, politics, education, and mostly in politics because everything has a political conditioning. As my colleague mentioned, the great name of Aristotle. Aristotle taught us that we are, by our nature, political animals, zoon politikon, so everything is with us, politics, for better or worse. So when I say that identity is the most fundamental concept in metaphysics, I'm not claiming that that is the most important aspect of dealing with identity, because I'm sure that dealing with identity in gender issues, feminism, or in anthropology is more important to our daily lives than dealing with very abstract issues as we do in metaphysics. Because for everyone, some people might not be familiar with how we use metaphysics. It's not that kind of obscurantist attitude, spiritual obscurantist attitude. We are using metaphysics in philosophy, in contemporary philosophy, as that systematic domain of philosophy in which we deal with the most abstract features of existence, of reality, like substance, properties, essences, accidents, causality, necessity, possibility. So it's a vast set of concepts through which we address the scientific issues and the practical and political issues in our daily life. So in a sense, trying to figure out these messy things, which are the philosophical concepts, is a prerequisite and is part of our human condition, because unless we can clarify those concepts, we are having extremely muddy thoughts about the other issues, and especially when it comes to societies and politics. So identity is this multi-layered concept which requires an interdisciplinary approach. And for sure, there couldn't be a better place to address those metaphysical issues of identity than the one in which we are actually now in, because everything started, in this regard at least, in the vicinity of this place. With Socrates, with Aristotle, mostly in the subject that I am addressing now, Aristotle was the founding father of the subject. Now, when I'm raising this issue of the multidimensional and the model features of identity, I'm also thinking at the relation of this concept with the notion of individual essence. And even though now in most social sciences, mostly in anthropology, in gender studies also, part of political studies, the very concept of essence has a sort of bad reputation. When we deal with this concept in metaphysics, well, there might be some people who say that even in metaphysics we cannot be neutral with regard to issues like gender and some other aspects of the real social life. But nevertheless, when we deal in a very abstract way with the things, the properties, the features, in virtue of which an entity is what it is, then I would say that that is neutral with regard to the projects that we develop in various other fields. And it's a sort of common denominator and common element which is in the overlapping of all those domains and dimensions of the social sciences and the humanities. Now, speaking about the methodology of addressing this issue, borrowing from a theory which was put forward some 30 years ago by the quite world famous American philosopher and cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett, in a book in which he tried to explain consciousness. I'm not buying into his views, but nevertheless, his main intuition, his main idea that consciousness could be approached and understood based on this multiple drafts model, according to which, and I'm quoting, all varieties of thought or mental activity are accomplished in the brain by parallel multi-track processes of interpretation and elaborations of inputs. So the idea that I'm having here when we deal with cultural identity now is that there are several perspectives, and it's very hard to put them all together in a sort of coherent model. And if we stick only to the logical and to the rational Aristotelian approach to identity, then unfortunately we leave out many features, many real features of cultural identities that are worth studying and are very important for our practical lives. So indeed, as I said, the topic is extremely difficult, and the Dennettian model seems promising to me because the way we can understand and explain individual consciousness and the consciousness of our societies, of our human species in general, is of paramount importance when we try to understand what are the features of our cultures. Because in the domain of society, politics, culture, language, you name it, the way we reflect upon some realities, the way we construct them in a sort of dynamic, fluid way is very important. The cultural identities are not objects which are out there. So as opposed to the metaphysical Aristotelian concept in which identity is sort of steady state object, when we deal with cultural identities, we deal with something which is extremely fluid, extremely vague, and unfortunately logicians could not develop until very recently a logic of vagueness, but those are the facts. Let me tell you right away that saying that cultural identity is a vague, fluid, dynamic concept is not something which is pejorative. is something quite essential to the idea of cultural identity. Because as opposed to many concepts that we are using in natural science, which are precise concepts, the other concepts that we are using in social sciences, in the humanities, are vague concepts. Not ambiguous. We can clarify them, we can precify them, but we do not have clear definitions according to which we have a set of necessary and sufficient conditions in order to pick up those objects. Now think about the Greek language. The old Greek language and the new Greek language. There are connections. There are threads. There is a continuity. But there is also a rupture. When we speak about the so-called essence of the Greek language, in which, of course, the cultural identity of Greece pertains mostly. We are speaking about a sort of vague cultural, historical, political concept in which we can find some traces of the old language, but we find many other aspects which were not predictable. Someone could not predict the new features of the Neo-Greek language based on the grammar feature of the old Greek language. So those are the things that I'm having in mind when I speak about the difficulty of the topic. Now, narrowing down a bit the subject and the concept, just to give you a bit of feeling how the concept could be accommodated in various contexts. I'm having here some very brief comments about a very important topic in ethics, in political philosophy, in anthropology, which is the concept of personal identity. Even in medical sciences, the concept is very important. I mean, in those branches of medicine which are related to psychology, for instance, the concept of personal identity is extremely important. Not to mention, of course, in what is related to decision-making, to responsibility, things of that sort, in which personal identity is very important in order to ascertain, to assess the actions of the individuals, to blame them for the wrong things that they are doing, or to praise them for what they are doing. Now, when we come to that, we already realize how hard it is to come up with those criteria which are going to set up in a very precise way in virtue of what I, for instance, Mircea Dumitru, I am the person who I am. Of course, I'm having some features which I'm sharing with you because I belong into the same biological, social, political species as you are belonging. But in addition to that, there should be something in virtue of which I am identical to myself and to no one else. And when we think to that, what it comes to our mind is this relation between the biological and neurological features of our brains, and then the psychological effects or psychological responses which are going on in our brains, of course, but which are also created by the interactions, the social interactions and the cultural interactions and political interactions with the other fellow human beings. One very interesting proposal that an American philosopher put forward some years ago in a paper, very influential paper called Identity and Necessity, and this gentleman is still alive and working at City University of New York, his name is Saul Kripke, was that when it comes to personal identity of a human individual, the origins, the biological origins, and also the upbringing, but first of all, in order to be educated, we have to live, to exist. So Saul Kripke is saying that, for instance, my mother and my father are essential for myself. In a sense, I couldn't have been born from different parents. Now, could we extrapolate that kind of sort of precise approach to personal identity, to cultures, for instance? Can we do that? Well, hardly so, because, well, if it makes sense, I mean, at least for me, it's very convincing. I'm having my parents in a sort of essential way. My parents were having their own parents in an essential way. And back, so on and so forth, maybe, I don't know, up to Adam and Eve, who knows. But there is something which is intuitively correct with regard to that. But when we speak about cultural identities, or I don't know, societal identities, it seems that things are more vague than when we speak about atoms or about individual human beings, let's say. So it may be that there is something lacking in the methodology when we address the issue of cultural identity. And if you look, for instance, on the slide, on the bottom, that piece of symbolism is expressing this very idea which stems back from Aristotle and was then elaborated by Leibniz, according to which, I mean, it's a sort of axiom. It's evident in itself. What it says that if you pick randomly two objects, X and Y, those objects turn out to be the very single one object if and only if all the properties that X is having are properties that Y is having. So in other words, X and Y should share the very same properties in order to be one and the very single entity. Again, this works nicely for precise concepts, maybe works only for personal identity, except that in the case of personal identity, we need to take into account the passage of the time, because one very serious issue is in virtue of what I myself now, when I'm 61 years old, am the very same person as the one who was born 61 years ago. I mean, many things changed. Okay? So from this kind of perspective, it's kind of hard to understand what personal identity is. So when it comes to cultures and to history, things are becoming even more complex and more difficult. Some people would say, especially people coming from my own philosophical tradition, which by and large is analytic philosophy, would say that this may be a sort of intractable problem. But again, don't fall prey to the confusion. When philosophers are saying that it is intractable, they are not saying that in a pejorative sense. After all, let's say Gödel proved that some mathematical problems were intractable, like completeness, for instance, of arithmetical system. We cannot axiomatize in a sort of complete way first order arithmetic. So it's nothing bad with arithmetic. It's just we cannot axiomatize it. It's incomplete. Likewise, a problem like this one, which is so important, could be intractable to the standards, to the very high standards that we set up as philosophers. Maybe that's, again, a bad methodology from our part. It's not the concept in itself. It's not the fact that people need to reflect and to know more and more about those issues. It's maybe about the very stringent approach that we impose via these logical instruments. Okay, now, quickly, yeah. So, well, I'm having here the paper, and I can submit it if people are interested here to have it in the final papers of the CVs. My main contention here is that what we can offer through humanities and social sciences, and mostly through humanities, based on my own 40-year experience in the field, is something which I truly do not believe that people working in, I don't know, biology or chemistry or mathematics could offer, because, and it's not about critical thinking. Well, that's important for each one of us. And of course, mathematicians are very, by their essence, they are critical thinkers. It's about the fact that we discuss, based on arguments, the nature of values. And we use that discussion not just to transfer to the next generation some pieces of knowledge. That's important in the university. But we use that kind of framework in order to model their reactions to the social issues and social facts. And I claim that universities, and especially universities who partake into this kind of new European project, which is this consortium, could do that to the extent that they accept the eminent role of the humanities in the overall liberal education, they could do that through this mechanism in which universities are facing back the history and are facing forward the future. When I'm saying that we look back into the history, what I claim is that we have to preserve the culture as it was constituted thus far. And also, we have to look into the future and to see how much from our previous culture actually should be discarded, like for instance, racism, or some other aspects that were part and parcel of the national curricula some centuries ago. And also what we can do for the future generation to equip them in order to deal with future problems. So in other words, I claim that the role that we can play is that role in which we can strike a balance between tradition and innovation and evolution. And humanities could help very much into that kind of projects. So I'm actually stopping here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Now we will hear from Ines de Castro. Oops, are you getting past me? Yeah, okay. And moving from the abstract to the concrete, because Ines is coming to us from the museum. No, that's okay. Oh,
okay. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me and for giving me the floor for a museum's perspective as an associate member of CIVIS and focusing on the practical side. World culture or ethnographic museums in Germany are at the center of a controversial public and media debate concerning their colonial legacy and their social relevance and role. The museums are accused that many of the objects in their collections were looted and entered the museum under ethically reprehensible conditions, mainly during the period of colonialism. They are also accused of reproducing and legitimizing colonial thought patterns until today, especially by emphasizing cultural differences. As you can see, this debate matters directly on the dynamic concept of culture, and it asks what definition or construction do we want to present as a cultural institution in the middle of Europe. Here is a picture of the Linden Museum in Stuttgart. Like other ethnographic or world cultures museums, the Linden Museum Stuttgart is actively engaged in this debate. With its collection of around 160,000 art and everyday objects from Asia, the Americas, Africa, and Oceania, it has for many years been engaged in a reflexive process of transformation. The strong connection to the time of colonialism that we share with most ethnographic or world cultures museums is a difficult challenge. The collection of the Linden Museum was assembled from 1882 on, mainly driven by our founder, Karl Graf von Linden, lawyer and servant to the King of Württemberg, a great networker that offered orders or medals against objects. The inauguration of the museum building took place in 1911. With this colonial perspective, only artifacts from outside Europe were collected, contrasting them with European artifacts that were assembled in other museums. Thus, the Linden Museum helped to establish a hierarchical perspective towards the world cultures, collecting foreign and exotic heritage. thus it also helped to define European heritage as our own identity. In this context, an additional problem arises. Museums often represent culture constructions in a very essentialistic way, based on only a few objects, defining identity or belonging with attributions that are related on a very small extract of the material culture of a region. There is no question that a museum of non-European art and everyday culture would not be founded in this form today, as it no longer corresponds to our diverse migration society. Nevertheless, the concept of a European culture is still present, holding some continuity from the colonial times. But how can a World Culture Museum overcome this burden of the difficult heritage? How can the museum no longer underline the dichotomy of Europe and the world? How can it replace attribution and stereotypes of the foreign with new perspectives and networks that overcome an outdated cultural construction? The aim is to find a responsible approach to the collections and their history, to find new forms of presentation, collection practice, as well as dialogical and multi-perspective formats. These new perspectives can also emphasize a more individual and subjective, more dynamic approach for the narratives and the stories told in the museum, avoiding homogenizing attributions and stereotypes. I would like to present some projects and the projects that are part of this reorientation. First of all, Provenance Research. Even though Provenance Research has always been part of the curatorial work at the museum, since 2016 we have been working on a systematic reappraisal of the provenance context to the collections, which vary greatly. We focus not only on the factual period of German colonialism, but on the period between the 15th century and today in global context, what we think that are colonial times. Participation and dialogical projects. An ethically respectful museum practice must allow a negotiation of interpretation and present different stories and narratives beyond the museum's curator's perspective, beyond the Eurocentric perspective. This can only succeed with the help of participatory formats and in collaboration and partnership with representatives from the societies of origin and the diverse urban society. In a series of exhibition and project, we are therefore experimenting with different participatory formats such as co-curated exhibitions, joint forms of collecting, what we call co-collecting, joint workshops, intervention by artists in exhibition and projects, residency programs, joint research, or also projects involving social participation of the civil society. And here you see some examples of that work. A good example also of a multi-voice implementation in the realm of a larger exhibition can be seen in the exhibition Where is Africa that we opened in 2019. It combined subjective views and contributions of various representatives from the societies of origin as well as from the Stuttgart diaspora, which were already incorporated into text, object selections, as well as presentation, and that we called our advisory board for the representation of African collections, or in short, ABRAC, and that worked with us to establish this exhibition for around 3 years every second Friday. This exhibition also shows an experimental subjectivity approach of the museum, putting the name of the authors in the exhibition texts, so naming the authors of every text, and to prevent an assumed objectivity of museums. we are trying to avoid only one narrative that's like, this is the objective narrative that we have. We try to just tell different stories. Additionally, this exhibition texts are not working with ethnic attributions, and in a world culture museum, this is not an easy task. Avoiding, for example, phrases like the Cameroonians or the Namibians, what we always do in museums. So I should also mention that our visitors have a hard time with these missing stereotypes. They really don't like that. Yeah. After a long time of ethnic designations, the new texts do not meet the expectations of our visitors, and this is a problem that we also have to face. We use the same approach in the collection online. The results of the Provenance Research and the findings on the historical role of the museum are shared transparently with the relatives and stakeholders of the societies of origin and with our visitors. At the Linden Museum, this is done both in the exhibitions and also here with the help of the Sammlung Digital, the collection online that is also available in English for sure. For this digital object presentation, we decided against the otherwise usual and faster transfer of internal databases and inventory books into a new digital format. So what the other World Cultures Museum in Germany do is just to take the internal database and just put this online format. In order not to reproduce discriminatory and racist terms and attributions, and in order to convey an awareness of a new ethical approach to the objects, these texts are reprocessed in cooperation with the Society of Origin. This means that this is a very hard work. Every object is reprocessed within participatory practices, because the internal databases of museums are normally copies of the inventory books from 1910, 1915, and we don't want to put that online. The important point here is that this database is also filled by externals, researchers or representatives of the so-called source communities, and also by the local society, who are in this case, as well as in the exhibition, mentioned by name. Awareness on colonialism. Our first speaker has emphasized also the relation between colonialism and European identity. So for us, this was also a very important point to create awareness. Until May 22, so a couple of weeks ago, the special exhibition Difficult Heritage, Linden Museum, Württemberg and Colonialism, in which the results of historical research on the history of Württemberg during the colonial period was presented. The museum initiated, specially for this exhibition, a historical research because our knowledge about the colonialism in Württemberg was non-existent. There were no dissertations, nor no works on that, so this was like a white, how to say, white spot. Yeah, okay. This show focused not on the role of the Linden Museum, This show focused on the role of the Linden Museum in colonialism and explored the little-known everyday world in Württemberg in that time. So the focus was not on the effects of colonialism in the German colonies, but on how it was represented in Württemberg and continues to have an impact until today. And the goal of this exhibition was for sure also to bring this forgotten discourse to a broad public, including schools. Here we also worked with different viewpoints or perspective that the visitor could adopt. So here you have, for example, a picture of our founder, Karl Graf von Linden, with two total different perspectives of how you can see this person. Yeah, what is the role of this person? Was he a saver of collections? Did he save these collections before the European colonialism could change the lives of colonized communities, or is he really a looter of colonial objects? So this was not to give the answer, this was just to point to questions and for the visitors, offering different perspectives. This is also our museum's entrance, and it is one of the only left colonial monuments still in Stuttgart, so that we also wanted to face an awareness on really this very stereotyped way of representing the museum's entrance. Related also to awareness of colonialism is also our focus on restitution that I don't want to speak here about, but that is very important issue and part of this new approach, and that we support really besides a lot of challenges. So I showed you some practical approaches of how we can deal with this changing and dynamic concept of culture. In order to overcome colonial thought patterns and to present a new perspective on culture in a diverse society, different groups in society must also be understood as an integral part of the entire museum practice in order to enable a multi-perspective approach in science, presentation, and mediation, and to strengthen the voices of marginalized or silent groups of society. The Ethnographic Museum or the World Culture Museum could thus become a place where meaning and interest of different groups and new concepts on European culture could be debated. Thank you.
Thank you, Ines, and all four of our speakers. We're going to now open the floor for discussion, just to get you started thinking perhaps of maybe a question you'd like to ask. I feel like that our four speakers offered many different perspectives on this topic of culture. Fatane began with anthropological perspective, ethnographic perspective, where and also problematizing this concept of integration, which seems to be very much part of the concept of way of life, you know, and using a culture concept that, you know, integrating people into a culture that means the food and the clothing and the gender performances and that sort of thing. And interesting that Antonia started talking about integration, and it was the integration of Europe as a political entity, and her concept of culture was political culture and civic culture, liberal democracy and plurality and participative. And what I also thought was interesting, in both cases, this term integration seemed to erase something. Different things, but in some way integration somehow has a problematic sort of dimension. So that was interesting, the interplay of those two talks. Of course, Antonia's talk also discussed the role of higher education in transmitting values, which was sort of the next step into what Mircea was talking about, with also the interplay of cognitive and affective aspects of identity and cultural identity. And I really appreciated Mircea giving us this concept of the vague nature of cultural identity, how imprecise it is, how fuzzy it is, because it gives us another way to theorize perhaps culture, or to think about, you know, how to theorize culture. And of course, the importance of the humanities in our discussions of European identity and in the work of European university alliances, which are challenge-oriented. And I think our panel makes very clear that this concept of culture is a challenge. This is why we have our hub on society, culture, and heritage. And then finally, Ines's talk comes sort of full circle to Fatane's beginning by discussing how Europe defines itself in opposition to an other that is non-European, and highlighting the importance of representation to make us understand what our identity is, and representations by objects or even performances or stagings of objects in museums. And the practices that her museum uses to interrogate this culture concept might actually be imported into our teaching methods, I think. You know, collaborative, emphasizing non-essentializing language, and not giving in to stereotypes, interrogating historical heritages in the ways we speak and present culture. So this is my sort of overview to remind you of what we've heard, and if anyone would like to ask a question right away, they could raise their hand, and if no one is ready, here's someone.
Culture or cultural identity something desirable? For example, when you left Iran and you choose Europe because the culture of Europe was desired, or it was something else that triggered it? And I think answering this question can give us an answer to the broader question. Do we need to define and then defend an European cultural identity? Because look what is now at stake. At national level, we have this movement of sovereignty, that we want to defend our cultural, our national cultural something, I don't know what. At European level, we have the debates. You remember when the European Constitution was on table, there was that debate about the Christianity of Europe as a main trait of the cultural identity of Europe. And my question is coming from, let's say, a more utilitarian point of view. Is this needed or not? It is the culture that defines us, or it is us that define the culture? Because even the European culture evolved in time. The European culture as of today is not the European culture of 200 years ago. As Professor Dumitru said, him when born is not the same person as him today. And I think this is the same thing with the culture. Cultures changes. The problem is when we define cultural identity, don't we put an emphasis on a picture at a certain moment? This is the culture. This is the European culture as of today. And we will fight to preserve it, because now it's about fighting to preserve European values, let's say. So I know it's a tricky question, and therefore I'm deflecting it into desirability. Is it the European culture that attracts immigrants, for example, in Europe, about Mrs. Merkel's policy on immigration? Let them come because they love our culture, or let they come because they want something else? They will preserve their own culture within the existing culture of their new country, but they like something else in there. I don't know what. Economics, politics, there could be freedom, there could be a lot of things in the package. Or are these part of the culture as well? Economics is part of the culture. Is, you know, we as Europeans, we are looking at the US and we are saying, no, they are better in economics, but they have no culture at all. So apparently economics is not part of the culture, or not a positive part of the culture.
Okay, I think we got your question.
Sorry,
no,
you
it's
know,
okay. It's okay.
You know, the question was very tricky, and therefore I tried to.
I think it's an excellent question. I mean, I think correct me if I'm wrong, Antonio, but it was Jean Monnet who said, if I could start all over again, I would not start with economic union, I would start with culture. So I think this opposition of economics and culture is a very classic opposition. But I would like to refer to the panel. Would someone like to respond to the question, do we need to define and defend a concept of culture?
Can I talk?
Sure.
Just shall I press something?
Mine is audible.
Do you hear me? Yeah. I guess the question was asked to me first if I desired Europe. I left my country when I was 19 years old and came as a refugee because of the war and an undesired revolution. And I didn't think of any desired culture. I rescued my life. And I guess, and during the time I have been living in Europe, I guess I have contributed a lot to the country I am living in. So I guess I am thankful, but that country should be thankful to me as well. So that's it. And the other aspect, I started my talk by saying that I would like to locate the concept of the culture and identity to the colonial history. It means that if people are here and if I am here because Europe have been in my countries, and not that only have been, is still there. So just people come to our countries because there is the consequences of the colonial past and current history of the colonial histories, and the huge economic gap that exists in our world is because of that colonial history. So if you want to disregard that, and even if you want to call that people are economic refugee, yes. Are you surprised? I mean, don't you decide to live to another countries or another cities because it offer you better job or for your kids? So that's people what are doing the same things. These people are leaving their countries because they want a better life, like us. What is wrong with that? I guess I stop here.
Chair, did you also want to respond?
Yes, I like to say something in response to my colleague and friend challenge. Actually, you touched upon many things, so it's kind of hard to address all the issues. But to your main question, should we defend European identity or European culture? Well, the simple answer is yes. The problem is that the concept of defending is very polemical. But when we put the concept in the context of, I don't know, anthropology, in which, as you mentioned in the beginning, you mentioned Talcott Parsons, but there are many other American sociologists who in the 40s, in the 50s, addressed the issue of sociology of culture. Culture is a way of life, a way of being for groups, for societies. So in my village, where I was brought up, in some remote part of Romania, it was a kind of expressing, I know, the interactions between people. So defending the culture was like making a strong statement in favor of the existence of that population. So when somebody else is coming and assuming the territory or, I don't know, the institutions, everything, as it happens now in Ukraine, for instance, then, of course, the military meaning of the term defending has some other dimensions. But when we put a concept into anthropological setting, it's quite natural to say that actually you have to preserve whatever we are and whatever we got. Then to the question, is culture defining us or we define the culture? So to that question, I would say both. It's not actually a dilemma there or something disjunctive. We, human beings, through our interactions and reflections, we define our own culture because actually we are interested in how we are positioned in the greater scheme of things. But likewise, when we come into the world, there is a pre-existing society, language, school, institutions, and we have to fit into those. So that kind of culture, lato sensu, is defining us. About the European Constitution, so indeed that was a sort of important discussion, especially in countries like Romania, which are more conservative. To what extent we have to preserve religion? And I mean, I am sure that you got that point. I wanted to stay very neutral with regard to many contentious aspects when we define cultural identity. I didn't say anything about that. as philosophers are doing when we don't want to engage into real issues, we talk about methodology and we talk about logic. So is religion important? Yes, for me it's very important, even though I'm agnostic. I'm not kind of religious person to go every Sunday to the church, but I realize that from a social and political and cultural perspective is very important. Why Europe decided not to accept at least a mention to the historical Christian tradition, that beats me. And yesterday I had a discussion over the phone with a colleague of mine who is a parliamentary in Europe, in Brussels, and he's a liberal, very liberal guy, and he told me that they wanted to pass a bill defending Christianity all over the world, because he mentioned to me that a lady got killed in a country in Africa. She was immolated just because she was a Christian. And in the context in which we defend Muslims, we defend people of many religions, not to mention the fact that there are places on earth in which Christians are killed just because, in virtue of the fact they are Christians, that's something bad. And that is not something that is going to upset the equilibrium in European Union, to my understanding.
Thank you. It's interesting that the topic of religion wasn't mentioned in any of our talks. I think religion and culture have a very complicated relationship. It might be the topic of a panel in and of itself. Would you please? Yes.
I would like to make only a very short comment. Oh God, I forgot now. No, yeah, no. I think the word defending is really problematic, because defending, for me, it's like putting the wall and isolating,
fighting against,
and not dialoguing anymore. So that would be for me a wrong concept to go for it. Yeah, to say this is what now I think with the war of Ukraine perhaps comes back to our society, and I'm kind of afraid of that. Yeah, that we are going backwards into this is the Ukrainians and the Russians, and and really forming again this national identities. But I would suggest that before we perhaps defend our European culture, we should discuss about it, and we should define what is that. And because I have the feeling that everybody here, if you ask, they would say something different, and that's good, yeah. But we should talk about it and make it more a topic that we should deal about, and also incorporating the colonial times, and to be aware and awareness of what it is and what it was, yeah, and what do we stand for, yeah. And I think that would be perhaps a better way.
I think, oh, thank you. I would agree with all the speakers. I think that culture is a very broad concept, and culture is not static. Culture is a product of an evolutionary process, and this evolutionary process has achievements, have moments of the glorious past that we are proud of, but it also has many dark pages as well. For long periods of our history in Europe, we were fighting each other, be it among Christians or among Christians and Muslim, whatever. For a long time of our history as Europeans, although not all states were colonial powers, major European powers had a very difficult colonial past, difficult heritage of colonial past. But all these experiences led us to a political choice after the Second World War. And this choice was not achieved through the creation of the European community, but in my opinion, through the creation of the Council of Europe, which was founded on the three pillars: democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. I think this was the greatest political step that the European states, initially the Western European states, and in the 90s also other states, that these states have realized in Europe in the 20th century. This was the turning point. Mm-hmm. And this is part of the European civic culture. And I would defend it, this part of the, using this hard word, defending, it's a very strong word. Yes, this is a way of life that I would like to defend, not vis-a-vis other religions or cultures per se, but as value systems, as ways of life.
Yes, a question up here. We can.
Yeah, it's coming.
She's coming. Thank you. So I would like to bounce off of the last remarks considering the Council of Europe, which I find quite interesting, which brought me to another topic, which is European Universalism, which is overly present in the Council of Europe and the law that comes from the Council of Europe, which is a topic that we often debate about, and most of the civic rights charters that were made, most of the universalist rights charters that were made, were created in a sense to proclaim universalism. I come from French University. The Déclaration des Droits de l'Homme of 1789 is one of those really good examples of where we consider that one case that applies itself to everyone. My question is, today in our European society, as far as we can speak of a society, is there still place for universalism? In the sense that I feel like Europe is made on diversity, on difference, on just being different, and that's what makes us interesting in a way, because we get to meet with all these people that are close to us, and yet so different, that have different habits, that have different languages. So is there still place for universalism in our contemporary Europe?
Well, it all depends on what you mean by universalism. Because if you mean, yes, that's the habit. If you mean individual human rights, the dignity of individual persons, not abstract persons, the dignity of women, children, grown-ups, men, youngsters, and so on and so forth, individual. That's an aspiration, regardless the culture and the societies in which we are brought up. You may be brought up in China, in Singapore, I don't know, in Iran. That's the aspiration for freedom, individual freedom. If societies and political systems are killing that kind of freedom, and if universalism means, amongst other things, protecting that kind of right, then of course I'm in favor of universalism. And if Europe is defending that line of argumentation, I'm in favor of Europe and Council of Europe. But in contradistinction to that, if by universalism what we mean is, for instance, and of course I'm joking, everyone should read Aristotle's Metaphysics, because that's part of the hard curriculum in philosophy. That maybe is too much. Because there could be people who are happy with Confucius, or I don't know, with some other guys that I am not aware of. So I am not in favor of that kind of universalism, which goes at the level of ideology, lato sensu. But I'm right in favor of the basic human rights. And those rights you have in John Rawls, for instance. If you studied political science and you studied a theory of justice by John Rawls, you saw which are those basic rights that we have under the veil of ignorance. Those are the liberal rights. Lato sensu, I don't speak in favor of some political party, liberal political party. I speak in favor of the great idea of liberalism that you have in Kant, you have in John Stuart Mill, and in some other utilitarians that you mentioned before, Radu. So again, it depends. Because if we ask the question in such an abstract and general way, we cannot give an answer.
Might I rephrase just momentarily so I can recenter? Yeah, I agree. That's why I posed why I questioned you in this way, so as to leave for debate. My question is more so the common demeanor in all of this, what you mentioned is basic human rights. I agree. We all agree that dignity is an objective. I don't think there's a debate on that. But what has been quite exhilarating about the European countries is that we all have a different way of getting to dignity. We all have a different way of approaching these subjects, and the Council of Europe...
What do you mean by that?
The thing is, in the Council of Europe, there's this beautiful thing, is that there's no one body of law. The law is interpreted in a lot of different ways. So human dignity has a lot of different expressions in the different countries of Europe, and there's not one universal way of conceiving human dignity.
Well, I don't want to monopolize.
So my question is today, is there a place for this universal conception in Europe? And it's purposefully
just a
fake.
comment to what you said. Still, when the countries may interpret differently human rights obligation in the within their territory, but when it comes to the case law of the Court of Strasbourg, there is uniform interpretation. So there is some kind of, I would say, process of adjusting to the standards of these rules through the Council of Europe. The states do not do whatever they want. Also, you have to bear in mind that implementation of Council of Europe's obligations or pending case law, pending decisions to be implemented in candidate member states of the EU, for example, are considered in the annual reports of the European Commission. So I don't think that states are free to do whatever they want when they participate in the system. It has many flaws, I agree, but I think it's quite advanced as well in terms of other regions of the world.
I would also add that these concepts, I mean, we're talking about the culture concept and how it's debated, what is it, it's vague on all of that. The same might apply to the concept of universalism. Universalism may even be I mean, when we're talking about culture, universalism is sort of the opposite of that. I mean, culture is cultural specificity, whereas universalism is supposed to be naked of culture. But is it really? And do we not need to continue to debate what we mean by universalism? If you go back 50 years, maybe as few as 50 years, you would find a definition of universalism based on a white, cis, male, heterosexual property owner. You know, I mean, who defines what human rights are? What is a human? You know, this evolves over time as well. And so we're constantly debating what we mean by these things, and that's what needs to stay alive, I think, is that culture of debate and negotiation, and that's what we have also European institutions for, I think, to ensure that we continue debating. So we have one more question, which I think would be our last question, unless someone is very, very desperate to ask another question, because it's almost 7 o'clock, and then that's when dinner will be served.
Yes. Thank you. My name is Susanne Tink, and I'm from Stockholm University. I'm a Hub Council member for this Hub arranging this panel. Thank you so much for your inspiring and very impressive presentations. And I'm a linguist as well, so sorry for just marking the words. And I agree that defending is not a proper term to use when it comes to European identity or Christian identity. I'm a Baroque researcher as well, and then during the time of the 30 Years' War, I mean, Christians killed other Christians, so it's not the real issue. I just want to turn the discussion maybe also on the behalf on the Hub into something constructive. because we maybe should discuss, and I am eager to hear what you have for ideas, how we can promote social cohesion and inclusion. And we had good suggestions for that. And at the meantime, as you said, from the Linden Museum, I found it quite striking that the people visiting the exhibition just were confused of not getting an answer. And I recognized that from my students who always, in the beginning, wants answers. So maybe this is also a task to educate in posing questions instead.
Thank you. Was that a question or more of a
comment? It was a remark, but a question was, so what are your suggestions? So how can we implement the concepts into a broader education within the civis network?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think you pointed out one of them, which also struck me, the devices or the procedures, the methods that are being used in the museum could be transferred to teaching processes. Fatma also wants to contribute.
Thank you, Susan. I guess I would answer your question, hopefully with some reflection regarding the previous question as well. But the universalism, everyone has mentioned that, it depends on how you define it. But I would like that the concept that you refer to, that how can we do that in order to work toward the more inclusion. And for me, just reflecting over the compulsory Eurocentrism that exists within the European university, at least Stockholm University or a couple of other European universities that I have been working with one way or the other, it just, then we can actually talk about the inclusion. In order to clarify, I would give you an example. For a couple of years ago, I was asked by a couple of my colleagues to contribute with the pedagogical text about the feminism theory for the teaching book that we could be used for the undergraduate classes. And they asked me to write about the feminist theory. First of all, I was very happy that for the first time I was asked to actually write about the feminist theory instead of post-colonial theory or Muslim women or just, okay, that's good. And then when I started to write that, I realized how hard it was, because then I was supposed to give a pedagogical narrative to the students for some things that I have always challenged, the first wave, second wave, third wave feminism that I didn't buy, and I find it is very Eurocentrism and Anglo-Saxon narrative of feminist theory and women movement. And after 3 months struggling with that, I realized I couldn't give that pedagogical narrative within that compulsory Eurocentrism that exists that could be pedagogical enough for the students. So I withdraw and I didn't write anything. The other things I try to do as a teacher is that to actually think about who are my reference list, who are the people I'm using. It's just not only white male who are presented as a knowing subject, or white women. Just now, at least in Stockholm University, as you know, they try to see that 50% men, 50% women. How about other aspect that we should think of, about the knowing subject? Who are we presenting as a knowing subject for our students? How are we inclusive in regard to what other, for instance, women have done in regard to feminist movement, or whatever aspect we want to talk about, universalism, human rights, how many narratives we have about the human rights defense in other parts of the world. So that is, for me, just challenging the Eurocentric narratives that we have in our universities. That is an important step toward the more inclusion.
Yes, I think this is just a point that we are trying in the museum, and with really incorporating people from outside, outside really our Eurocentrical viewpoint. And this is so rich and so valuable. You get totally different insights, and also trying to hire the diversity of the staff. This is, I think, the most difficult point, that also for universities, I think, quite challenging, and because we have our structures, so you have to go on structural changes. I think this is a very important part of this, to really not only incorporate people from outside, but to change the structures so that they are really part of the whole university. That would be, I think, an important point to do. And in Germany, that's very difficult.
Not only in Germany, I
Okay.
think. So, since we've reached the end of our time, I would just say that thank you for your questions, for this really invigorating debate. I think we can continue at dinner discussing these things. In fact, I would say that our discussion really showed what a huge challenge this concept of culture presents, and why it is appropriate to have it at the topic of a challenge-oriented hub. I think that we've also shown that challenging Eurocentric narratives in the university must be part of our work building a European identity. In fact, what we're discussing about what it means to be European must include the reflection on these topics. We have to have a free debate, an open debate, in order to really avoid these pitfalls that we discussed in the beginning. So I feel like we've put a great foot forward in this diverse, interdisciplinary discussion, and I thank everyone for their contributions. And let's go have a nice evening.
Even if the people are against it, we have to still do it, huh?
Yeah, exactly.